Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. Scott Anderson is with us. He is the prolific author of 4 books, including 2 novels. His latest, a riveting book entitled The Quiet Americans, is about 4 men who were spies for America during the Cold War. Frank Wisner, a patrician lawyer turned spy master. Peter Sichel, a German Jew who escaped the Nazis. Michael Burke, a swashbuckling football star. And Edward Lansdale, an ad man who became a legendary spy network in the Philippines. Why did they do it, and what did they accomplish? Our guest will tell us. We're pleased to welcome Scott Anderson to the program.
Thank you, Jim. My pleasure to be here.
Now, congratulations on your book, The Quiet Americans. Is this a riff on Graham Greene's novel?
It is.
The Quiet American?
It is. It's a bit of a take on that. It seems to be a pattern with my previous book was called Lawrence in Arabia, taken from Lawrence of Arabia. So it seems to be a pattern of mine to crib other book titles.
It's like an O. Henry twist.
Right.
Now, your subtitle is A Tragedy in 3 Acts. What was the tragedy and why 3 acts?
Well, I think the tragedy was that so this book very much is focused on the early part of the Cold War, from the end of World War II in 1945 up to the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. And I really felt through doing research and through the stories of the men I'm writing about, that there was kind of a golden opportunity with the Hungarian Revolution in 56, that the Cold War could have been ended at that point. And instead, because of what happened in the Hungarian Revolution, Khrushchev had just come to power, but the Americans were still very much in kind of the Red Scare moment of American politics. This chance for an opening passed, and it remained passed for the next 33 years until Gorbachev came along. So that's kind of why ultimately I see it as a tragedy. The 3 acts is really the first act is coming out of World War II. The Americans, I feel, were very slow to recognize the threat from the Soviets. Truman had this idea that we could maintain the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union when Stalin was already grabbing up Eastern Europe and planning greater acquisitions in Iran. Korea was shortly to come, and then the fallout of that in the period of the Red Scare in this country that to my mind was very misdirected and destroyed a lot of lives and prolonged the Cold War.
Now, the granddaddy of all this was the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was the ancestor of the CIA. It functioned during World War II. All 4 of the people you write about were in the OSS and then morphed into the CIA during the Cold War. But how did the OSS compare with the CIA as it began to evolve?
I think the great mistake that Americans made was thinking, the OSS, as you said, was during the wartime, during World War II. CIA came along in 1947. There were a couple of temporary organizations that linked the two. But I think that in the early Cold War, CIA thought that the tactics and strategies that worked in World War II with the OSS could just be replicated. And in fact, you were in a very, very different type of conflict. So yes, all 4 of the men I write about all came out of the OSS. At the end of World War II, in the summer of 1945, 2 stayed on in intelligence capacities for the American government. 2 went back to their civilian lives. Over the next 2 years, the Cold War really set in. It looked like Greece was going to fall to the communists. The CIA was created in 1947. Finally, Truman recognized that the Soviets were not going to be a post-war ally, that they were going to be, in fact, an adversary. So he started the CIA. The other 2 men who had left the OSS both had wives and young children, and I think they missed the game. And so when they were approached to join the CIA, both instantly had joined up. And in fact, one of the men, Peter Sichel, that you mentioned, is still alive. He is turning 100 next week. He was an amazing man.
He was a wine merchant, wasn't he?
He was a wine merchant, that's right. He after he left the CIA in 1960, his family had been wine merchants in Germany prior to World War II. He inherited the family wine company, and was actually responsible for Blue Nun, if you remember that wine from the 1960s and 70s. That was Peter's handiwork in the U.S.
Well, I probably drank so much of it that I don't remember. Now, did these four men know one another?
Most of them did. The one exception to that was Lansdale, who was, so Frank Wisner during the war knew both Michael Burke, the football star, and Peter Sichel. They had all been in Europe. Ed Lansdale had what they called a bad war in World War II. He never left the States. He was older, and he had a medical condition, so he was never posted abroad during the war. He went out to the Philippines immediately after the end of World War II, and so he was very much in the Asian theater of the anti-communist effort. So he was the exception. The other three all knew each other. They all worked in Europe, both in World War II and in the early Cold War.
Now, John Foster Dulles, our hawkish Secretary of State, recognized that something that was kind of counter to American foreign policy, or eventually came to recognize it, that it really wasn't all about Soviet expansion and domination of world politics. It was something else. You want to talk about that a little and how it affected the spy agencies?
Yeah, absolutely. To my mind, John Foster Dulles was one of the great villains of the 20th century, and really kind of hastened the end of the American century. Dulles saw everything in very black and white terms when he became Eisenhower's Secretary of State, and you know, you were talking about the early 1950s, at a time when independence movements were spreading all throughout the Third World, in the former colonial possessions, and Dulles saw virtually all of these as communist fronts, and actively fought against them. The other thing he did was parliamentary governments in Guatemala and Iran that were non-aligned and trying to pursue a kind of a non-alignment between the United States and the Soviet Union. He saw those as communist fronts. So in Guatemala and Iran, in 1953 and 1954, the democratic governments were overthrown by the CIA. Belatedly, as he was dying from cancer, Dulles recognized or acknowledged that, in fact, a lot of these independence movements, the anti-colonialist movements, were not inherently pro-communist. They just wanted independence and autonomy they wanted to stay out of the superpower great game. But by that time, an awful lot of damage had been done, and adding to the disillusionment of at least two of the men that I write about, and both these men left the CIA during that time.
One of the principal spy masters, indeed perhaps the principal spy master you write about, was Frank Wisner.
Right.
Very interesting, fascinating character, Wall Street lawyer, patrician background, almost Wild Bill Donovan's model.
That's right.
Of a spy. Donovan was the founder of the OSS during the war, in which Wisner participated. Could you talk a little bit about Frank Wisner and what his contribution was?
Yeah, Frank Wisner is a fascinating figure. As you said, he was very patrician, a Wall Street lawyer from a very wealthy family from Mississippi, central Mississippi. Went to UVA Law School, top of his class, hired by a white shoe firm on Wall Street.
Same firm that Franklin Roosevelt was.
That's right. That's right. And quit in 1940, before the Americans came into the war. Since the war that America was going to have to join the war, quit, joined the Navy, and eventually was transferred over to the OSS during the war. The amazing thing with Wisner, he was probably the first American serviceman to see what happened when the Soviet Red Army marched into a country. He arrived in Bucharest, Romania in the summer of 1944, right when the Soviet Red Army was sweeping west against the Nazis. And he saw how basically the Soviets were just taking over Romania in lockstep and very, very fast. And he was sending cables back to the OSS headquarters in Washington saying, look, I know they're our allies, but this is what they're doing, and they're going to do it elsewhere. Washington didn't want to hear it because, of course, we're still allies. We have to defeat the Nazis. So everything else is secondary until that happens. So Wisner was one of the first people. He was kind of the canary in the coal mine as far as seeing what Stalin's designs were going to be in the post-war era. He goes back to his law firm at the end of the war. When the CIA starts up, he's approached and asked if he wants to head the clandestine operations wing of the CIA. Called the Office of Policy Coordination. And the name deliberately chosen to be incredibly boring, so no one would know what they were really up to. And the name itself, the Office of Policy Coordination, was a national secret for 25 years. So Wisner headed that. So Wisner was really the man sitting behind the desk in Washington, running all the clandestine operations of the CIA throughout the early Cold War. His great dream was to provoke a true anti-communist uprising in a Soviet-controlled country, especially in Eastern Europe. So the CIA had operations throughout the Soviet Union and in the Soviet bloc nations of Eastern Europe to drop anti-communist partisans behind the lines late 1940s through the 1950s. All the operations were disasters. The KGB had all these groups thoroughly infiltrated from the get-go. Hundreds, if not thousands, of men lost their lives doing this. And the great tragedy in Frank Wisner's life was that with the spontaneous anti-communist uprising in Hungary in 1956, finally, after 11 years of trying to provoke something and only meeting disaster, here's something that really happened. The CIA never saw coming, ironically enough. The agency had no idea that Hungary was about to explode.
Spontaneous combustion.
Spontaneous combustion. And Wisner happened to be in Europe at the time. He's sending cables back to Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles saying, it's finally happened. We have to, this is what we've been working for all this time. We have to support the Hungarian freedom fighters. And
then the tanks rolled in.
And Eisenhower realized that, if we actually, after all this lip service of liberation of captive nations, if we actually involve ourselves, it could provoke World War III. So they just stood back and let the Hungarian revolutionaries be crushed. And it crushed Frank Wisner. In fact, he had a massive nervous breakdown at that time and ended up which he never really recovered from. And from then on, he had psychiatric problems. He ended up committing suicide in about 9 years later, actually on the very anniversary of the Hungarian Revolution. The day the tanks rolled in was the day he killed himself.
So great tragedy.
Yeah.
Now, what did these four men have in common, if anything?
That's a great question. And I think ultimately the appeal, of course, patriotism, and the notion of that time that I think one thing they shared was this idea that we've defeated one enemy, the Nazism, fascism, but here comes another one that's coming that it's set out to, like fascism, to enslave the world. I mean, that was their worldview. I think also just a love of adventure. These men had been plucked from their normal lives. They had had crazy adventures in World War II. Michael Burke had been airdropped behind Nazi lines in France and joined the partisans in battles in the French countryside. And then to kind of be dropped back into your stateside existence, and I think was very hard for them to adjust to. I think the other thing that had a great appeal in the early CIA was they were kind of making things up as they went along. So there was guys in the field had a tremendous amount of latitude and freedom of action. It wasn't yet everything being controlled by 7 layers of authority above you. Guys were put in the field. Peter Sichel was the CIA station chief in Berlin, and kind of just left to. He was 22 years old when he was CIA station chief, and just kind of expected to figure things out as he went along. So I think that was a huge part of the appeal.
A sense of patriotism and adventure, and also responsibility and power.
And power, right, and personal initiative, and I mean, it must have been. Of course, war is always an awful thing. Except this was by and large, it was not a shooting war, the Cold War. But I've talked to Peter Sichel about it, and he, at one point he came back to the States in 1947, and he was thinking about taking over his family's wine business at that time. He'd been away for the previous 5 years, both in World War II and then in the post-war, and he arrived back in New York and just said, "You know what? I can't do this. It's like." Berlin was the center of the universe in 1947. So he was here for about 10 days, and he had handed in his resignation from the successor of the OSS, and he tore up his resignation and went back to Berlin. So.
Now, Ed Lonsdale focused mainly in the Philippines.
Philippines and Vietnam.
And
yes.
well, first the Philippines.
That's
he
right.
had great success there in putting down a communist insurrection, didn't he?
That's right. That's right. And the great irony of Lansdale is that he arrived. He first arrived in 1945, right at the end of World War II. He was in the Philippines off and on for the next about 6-7 years. And one reason, kind of going to my last point about the incredible freedom of action these men had. This communist insurgency had started up in the Philippines, and he was sent with 2 aides to try to help the Filipino military figure out how to combat this insurgency. And it was almost the minuscule size of this American mission to help the anti-communists in the Philippines was what made it successful. After he was successful in the Philippines, he really did help kind of reform the Filipino military, found a populist leader who, the political leadership of the Philippines had always been incredibly corrupt, run by oligarchies. I found a populist leader.
In Magsaysay.
In Magsaysay, right. And then, when he came back to Washington, the Dulles brothers said, okay, we have another problem in Asia. We want you to go and just do the same thing you did in the Philippines. And that was Vietnam in 1954. So Lansdale went out, he was the head of the first American military mission into South Vietnam in 1954. It consisted of him and 12 American soldiers. That was it. And again, over the next year and a half, probably because there was no bureaucracy involved, these men were allowed to feel their way and try things out that they thought would work, and they're among the Vietnamese people. Probably came closer to actually saving, in scare quotes, South Vietnam than the 500,000 troops that were going to be there by 1968. It was the very size of the American involvement in Vietnam that ultimately, I think, that doomed it to failure.
By the way, Wisner functioned in the Philippines with Lansdale, did he not?
A little bit.
Yeah.
He would have been more in a supervisory role. He came out to the Philippines a couple of times. But he wasn't really based in the Philippines as much, but he made fact-finding.
Now, Lansdale recognized that the United States policy in Vietnam was doomed to failure.
Right.
But he didn't resign in protest.
That's right.
Went back to Washington.
I think it goes to this issue of wanting to stay in the game. It's a hard game to leave, especially when you have the freedom and the authority that a man like Lansdale had. The important thing that I think Lansdale really was a visionary in a lot of ways, and what he said in the Philippines and he said it again in Vietnam was, it's not enough to be against something. It's not enough to be anti-communist. If you want to have these countries be anti-communist, be pro-West, you have to give the people something to believe in. You have to give them a government that answers to them. And this sounds very obvious, but for some reason it was quite revolutionary at the time. And so Lansdale became known as the miracle worker of Asia. And really all he did was push this idea of exporting the American dream and listening to the local people and listening to what they wanted, whether it was agrarian reform or electrification or, schools, medical clinics. That's really what it came down to.
Well, that's what worked in the Philippines.
That's what worked in the Philippines, yeah, and that's what he was trying to do in Vietnam.
So you had a pattern that seemed to exist both under the OSS regime and and later on of training spies and sending them into these communist countries.
That's right.
And they probably were exposed at some point, or they just were ineffective, and it really didn't work. And Lansdale recognized that.
That's right.
Isn't that right?
That's right. And the thing with these anti-communist, these partisan groups that were operating all through Eastern Europe is the Americans were really babes in the woods when it came to counterintelligence, and the KGB had these groups wired from the get-go. So they probably knew the moment they were being airdropped in that they were on their way. And actually, Peter Sichel, it's kind of an amazing story of how he left the CIA. It was 1960. He was the CIA station chief in Hong Kong at that time, and the number 2 man in the CIA came out. There was a meeting in Hong Kong of the regional CIA station chiefs, and the number 2 man said, "We're starting a new program against Mao's China, and it's going to be $100 million, which is a lot. That was money back then. We're going to be dropping anti-communist partisans into Mao's China, and with the idea that they're going to foment a revolution." And Peter Sichel, during a break in this conference, took his supervisor aside and said, "Look, we'd save so much time and money if we just killed them ourselves. This is doomed to failure." And then right there he said, "I'm out. I'm done. I can't do this again." And this was also Michael Burke. His experience, he had been head of clandestine operations in Germany in the immediate post-war, and it had been his main job to be dropping all these commandos behind the Iron Curtain, and again saw hundreds of men just vanish. And that was ultimately the reason he left too. He just couldn't see this bloodbath happening anymore.
So what Sichel meant by we'd do just as well killing them ourselves, he meant killing our agents.
Right, that's right. Killing all these people that we were going to be dropping in.
Our assets.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And so that's the way it ended. Now, what is it about the intelligence services, about the CIA? So many directors have left either under a cloud or have lost the confidence of the president and were replaced. And certainly we saw in the Trump administration certainly no respect or regard for the intelligence services. What is there about spycraft that gets so many people in trouble? And is it the Church Committee investigation in 1975 showed?
Right. I feel like the CIA throughout its history has oscillated between this very activist approach, where you talk about the Church Committee in 1975, or the early CIA, where they're doing commando operations or overthrowing governments in Iran and Guatemala. So there's that whole activist side and you're going to get caught out eventually with that kind of stuff in a free society with an open media. You're going to find out about Iran. You're going to find out about Guatemala, no matter how much you try to keep it quiet. And so that's going to blow back on you. I think in another way there is this massive bureaucracy now that's built up around the CIA, and it's often, like in any bureaucracy, it's often very difficult to get a contrarian voice to move its way up the ladder to a position that reaches the people that decide policy. People, and we saw this with with Iraq, of course, in 2003. People in the field were casting doubt on the whole issue of WMDs and Saddam Hussein. But what happened to those voices? Because the administration at the top is convinced or wants to be convinced that something exists, it's very difficult for those voices to reach, to go on up. So I think you have the problem you have with the CIA, and maybe it's inherent to most spy agencies, is you have the sins of commission, the overthrows of democratic regimes, and you have the sins of omission, of things you just are blindsided by because of the way your organization is set up. It's not designed to detect these sorts of issues or to have the word climb the ladder.
Okay, so I have a question for you, Scott Anderson, because we have to wrap up.
Okay.
And my question is that we hear so much in terms of intelligence nowadays about SIGINT, signal intelligence, about drones, which were and are handled by the CIA. We have cyber and not so much about the old-fashioned spycraft. So my question for you is, where are the quiet Americans today?
I think they're probably sitting. Most of them are sitting in Langley, looking at computer screens. Unfortunately, they're not out having great adventures.
In Langley, Virginia, in front of a screen.
That's right.
Oh,
Right.
Scott Anderson, it's been marvelous, and thank you so much
My
for coming
pleasure,
by.
Jim.
Thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. Meanwhile, visit our website, conversationswithjimzirin.com. And also, take care, be well, all the best. I'm Jim Zirin. Have a good day.